Global Vision presents on this week's program.
Hello. Good afternoon. Is this the US Consulate in the Kenny building in Johannesburg?
Yes. You're calling from the press?
Yes, I am.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm not allowed to put any calls through to the three people themselves. That is the embassy policy.
3 anti-apartheid activists who escaped from detention still taking refuge in the U.S. Consulate in Johannesburg. But the U.S. government won't let the media interview them. We have more on the story.
One more word out of you and I'll check you out.
As negotiations continue, we'll look at prospects for peace in the area.
I'm very optimistic that we may have a settlement within the next 2 weeks or so.
From inside Angola, the first pictures on American television of the Cubans in battle. We have a new Cuban TV report complete with Fidel Castro's view.
And I think it is very important for you to be aware that we are working seriously for a settlement.
And you'll meet South Africa's hottest band, the multiracial Savuka, and its star Johnny Clegg. You're watching South Africa Now.
I've noticed in your country that if it's not on the tube, then it hasn't happened.
And I can assure you that the government does not use all the force.
90 South African laws restrict news gathering. The Protection of Information Act threatens journalists with jail.
It's got nothing to do with government policy. It's got nothing to do with apartheid or anything like that.
Because it is important that people know what is happening.
Sanibonani. I am Fana Kekana, a South African, and your host this week, introducing a new series of programs called South Africa Now. Each week, our program will cover news, background, and cultural reports. None of our stories have been cleared by media censors. We are here to demonstrate that the story of South Africa can be reported on American TV, despite the state of emergency inside the country and the crisis in the region. Our lead story this week involves developments inside South Africa. For an overview and update, here's South Africa Now correspondent Tony Weaver in Cape Town.
The South African government has now made it clear it will brook no interference with its plans to hold national municipal elections later this month. Against the backdrop of a spate of bomb attacks, the security police swooped. At least 25 people have been detained and several more have been restricted. And senior police sources were quoted by government newspapers as saying that the clampdown had only just begun. More detentions and more bannings would follow. Police have also issued a warrant for the arrest of student leader Clifford Mkobo, who has joined 3 senior UDF leaders who have taken refuge in the United States Consulate in Johannesburg. The 3 leaders, Valli Moosa, Morobe and Vusi Khanyila, have criticized the American authorities for refusing to give them access to the media. They have also criticized the authorities because another man, Max Mankanaza, was evidently turned away from the doors when he tried to seek refuge. Mankanaza was detained by security police as he left the building and is still in detention. This is Tony Weaver in Cape Town for South Africa Now.
There was considerable confusion at the building housing the US Consulate when the activists took refuge there. A consular official explained Washington's policy on the matter.
The United States does not offer asylum in its consular and diplomatic premises. However, consistent with this policy, we permitted these men to enter the consular premises, and we will not press them to leave against their will.
Mrs. Murphy Morobe was among family members visiting the detainees.
One of the demands was to lift the state of emergency.
Yes, sure.
Will they insist on lifting the state of emergency?
Yes.
They will, but then they won't.
Until the demand they meet, I think they are not yet prepared to go out until this 1, 2, 3 are met.
Well, soon the local press was pushed off the premises as an Afrovision crew documented.
Not only just for them, but for everyone.
Move! The people from the building want to get out. Move! Come on! Mister, do you want to get out of this building? Do you want to get out of this building? You just shut up, eh?
The men in the consulate desperately want the world to know their demands. We were easily able to reach their lawyer, Krish Naidu.
They've set out 4 demands. The first one is that the state of emergency be lifted. The second one is that detainees be released. The third one is that the restriction on organizations be lifted. And the fourth demand is an assurance that when they leave this consulate, they would not be arrested or detained in terms of the existing emergency regulations.
He told us the men inside feel that most of the foreign media seems to have lost interest in the story. South Africa Now asked the State Department if any U.S. news organizations had filed a formal complaint against the denial of access. We were told none had. It is this seeming lack of aggressiveness on coverage of stories like this that anger anti-apartheid leaders like Reverend Allan Boesak, who spoke with us in Cape Town.
What should happen is that foreign journalists should say altogether, we're very sorry, we cannot work under these circumstances. Our presence here helps to uphold the illusion of democracy, the illusion of press freedom. We will withdraw. And our withdrawal will be a more eloquent statement about the situation the South African government has created than any amount of writing that they are doing right now.
This is Carolyn Craven reporting. Is peace breaking out in southern Africa? Official white South Africa is upbeat. Foreign Minister Pik Botha.
We certainly support the idea of national reconciliation and of creating peace through negotiation and not to resort to the bullet to achieve political objectives.
As the negotiating process on peace in Southwest Africa continues, there's been confusion in the press. The New York Times reported that an agreement in principle was reached. On the same day, the Washington Post said the opposite. At the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, Senior Africa Specialist Michael Clough is optimistic.
We're in a very interesting period in southern Africa. There now is probably a greater chance of a settlement of the conflict in Angola and the conflict in Namibia than there has been at any time since certainly 1980. There are a lot of uncertainties in the process, but I think the most important reason for some hope is that all of the parties, for a variety of reasons, now finally seem to think this is the time to settle.
But Namibian leader Toivo Jatoivo is skeptical.
I myself don't trust the South Africans. They are liars, cheaters, and crooks.
At the New York offices of the Southwest Africa People's Organization, the SWAPO Secretary General explains why he thinks that Namibia independence may be farther off than the press has intimated.
Indications are that South Africans are not prepared to pull out of Namibia. At this very moment, according to our sources of information, every night the South Africans are in the road carrying their war material to the north. And informations are that there is a higher concentration of South African occupation troops on the northern of Namibia. And this gives us doubts.
In Mozambique, scene of a recent visit by the Pope and later by South African President Botha, there's been a new agreement with Pretoria. Foreign Minister Pascoal Manuel Makumbi is wary but hopeful.
Let us take it seriously. And the experience will say that who is right, who is wrong. When we go to a table of negotiation, we go there faithfully, and then the results will show whether we are wrong or we're right.
We also heard from Zimbabwe President Mugabe on South Africa's latest overtures toward Mozambique.
But you know, they are not given to honesty. They are not given to frankness. They are not given to peace in the area. And therefore, Botha and his regime can never be trusted. I don't think they will desist from the practice of sponsoring and nurturing bandits to sabotage our economies.
You're watching South Africa Now, a weekly television news magazine featuring news, background reports, and cultural segments from Southern Africa. These reports have not been cleared by media censors.
The media often echoes the conservative view that Cuba's involvement in Angola represents communist aggression. Usually unreported is how Angola's government, Havana, and some respected Africa experts see it. That's the subject of this week's background segment.
When you meet a white South African,
con un racista,
a racist,
lo único que tienen que
the only
preguntarle
thing you have to ask him
¿qué
is
pasó en Cuito
what
Cuanavale?
happened in Cuito Cuanavale?
¿Qué pasó en
What
Cuito
happened in
Cuanavale?
Cuito Cuanavale?
Esa es la cosa que hay que preguntarle.
Fidel Castro's question refers to the military showdown in the southern Angolan river town of Quito Carnaval between a South African military invasion force and the combined Cuban and Angolan armies earlier this year. It raises anew questions about Cuba's role in the southern African conflict. More than 50,000 Cuban troops are estimated to be in Angola, and many area specialists believe that Cuba's military deployment has been responsible for pressuring South Africa to the bargaining table. South Africa Now spoke with two respected analysts.
I think the Cubans were convinced that the only way the South Africans would be persuaded to pull out of southern Angola and to give independence to Namibia was if they saw how serious the military situation was for them. And I think the Cubans were right. And I think one of the surprising things is that there's been a lot of indications that American officials behind the scenes have agreed with that.
U.S. government officials knew that now, the State Department knew that the Cuban troops would be increased. They didn't act, and they didn't choose to make it public. Principally because the Cuban troops attacking the South Africans served the same interests as the U.S. had in the region, and that was to bring the South Africans to the bargaining table. And the U.S. gave what I called a wink and a nod to the Cubans to go ahead.
But I think that the State Department realizes had it not been for that Cuban action, we would not have the progress that we've seen in the negotiations.
And what do the Cubans say? They have just televised a dramatic 3-hour film made by their army chronicling their own military buildup and the dynamics of their confrontations with the South Africans. Obtained by South Africa Now and undeniably a partisan weapon in the propaganda war, this film shown here for the first time on American television depicts how the Cubans see their role in the war. The film is called Response to the South African Escalation. It begins by asserting that the South Africans were staging a military buildup in order to control southern Angola by partitioning the country at Quito Carnaval, site of a strategic airstrip. It shows that Pretoria's army was well equipped with advanced weapons of U.S., French, and Israeli manufacture, and that they were also using black troops from Namibia and UNITA, Angolans opposed to the Angolan government. The South African buildup, the Cubans say, included military support for Jonas Savimbi's UNITA. The film shows South African cabinet members and P.W. Botha visiting Savimbi. That is a poster of Savimbi and President Reagan in the background. Savimbi has also been receiving assistance from the CIA.
So they penetrated between 200 and 300 kilometers inside the country.
As South African artillery pounded Quito Carnaval late last year, the Cubans decided to respond. The film shows planning meetings of Castro and his generals.
We need a strong defense of the area. Strengthening the Cuban military contingent with the forces and necessary equipment was the first decision taken by Fidel at the request of the government of the People's Republic of Angola.
There is footage of tanks being shipped out of Cuba and arriving in Angola. The film does not mention that the equipment is Soviet-made or who pays for it. There are interviews with soldiers who say they are volunteering for the mission.
Are there any other members of your family who participated in international missions? No, none. So you'll have the honor of being the first. The honor of being the first.
Cuban film crews followed the army as it heads south to confront South Africa.
Y la admiración de 10 millones de cubanos están con ustedes.
And then the power of the Cuban army and its weapons become visible. The fighting is fierce.
Cuban troops have moved into direct battle, and they have a resolve that the South African troops don't have. They are more experienced in guerrilla warfare. They're more experienced in the kind of battle that is taking place.
Ultimately, the Cuban radars, artillery, and air power took supremacy of the skies. The South Africans felt the pressure as the casualties mounted.
Once more in these attacks, the South African enemies and their puppets had to pay with their lives for their adventures.
Negotiations soon followed, and an agreement is in sight.
I think it is very important for you to be aware that we are working seriously for a settlement. We are determined to work seriously for a solution.
In the same way that President Reagan talks about peace through strength, I think that the Cuban buildup in southern Angola has to be seen as peace through strength.
In the weeks ahead, South Africa Now will present background reports on other players in the conflict in southern Africa.
The Southern Africa story is not just a political one. It has its cultural edge. Each week, South Africa Now will offer the best in music, drama, film, and other cultural expressions from the region.
His name is Johnny Clegg, and he is the leader of one of the hottest new pop groups in the world.
I know I can make it on my own if I try, but I'm searching for a great heart to stand me by underneath the African sky. A great heart to stand me by.
The band, a multiracial group of South African musicians, is called Savuka, which is Zulu for "we have arisen." Lately, Savuka's infectious blend of traditional African folk music and modern Western sounds has interest rising among audiences and critics worldwide.
There's a highway of stars across the heavens. There's a whispering song of the wind in the grass. There's a rolling thunder across the savannah. A hope and a dream at the edge of the sky. And your life is a story like the wind. Your life is a story.
I first became interested in African music in Johannesburg. I grew up there as a schoolboy, and I met street musicians, Zulu street guitarists, and I was very intrigued with the way this Western instrument had been thoroughly Africanized. It was played differently, it was conceived of differently, and it was tuned differently, and different demands were made on it as an instrument. The first person who taught me anything about the guitar was a flat cleaner who lived around the corner from us, and every day after school I would go up to his place. He couldn't speak English and I couldn't speak Zulu, so we basically just sat silently smiling at each other, and I would copy everything that he was showing me, and slowly I began to learn a lot about the language through singing it. At the age of 15, I met an incredible Zulu street musician who later became my partner for 17 years. His name was Sipho Nkunu. He was a migrant worker from Zululand. He had no formal education. He couldn't read or write English or Zulu. He couldn't speak English either when I first met him. He taught me all I know about how to use the language and how to compose in it. He taught me how to stick fight, A lot of the body movements in Zulu war dancing relate to stick fighting, and some of the symbolism in the arm movements and the gesture relate to stick fighting. So before I could really understand what the dance was about, I actually had to learn to fight with a stick, be hit by a stick and understand the movements, all those kinds of things.
Clegg's interest in Zulu music and customs led him to form a new kind of band, one that played a type of music never heard before.
We managed to come up with a meld or a mixture, a hybridized form of music which is very peculiarly our own. And in 1979 we had 10 songs which we decided to record, and we decided to call ourselves Juluga.
But the South African government's racial policies led to problems for the band.
In the early periods of the Juluka project, we experienced various forms of problems with the authorities, mainly to do with the white members of the band not being able to play in the townships, because at that time you needed government permission to enter the township. We calculated between 10 and 15% of our shows closed down by the police, who, when they discovered we were playing in the townships, would say, stop the show, come in on the stage and tell everybody to leave the hall because the white members of the band didn't have permission.
Juluka released several albums internationally, but never achieved stardom outside South Africa. Finally, 3 years ago, Juluka disbanded.
And with the disbanding of the group, I felt particularly dissatisfied with the fact that we had worked so hard to develop this particular form or style of music, and we were nearly bringing it to full fruition on the international music scene.
In the meantime, however, a cassette of Juluka's music found its way to American pop star Paul Simon and stirred his interest in the burgeoning South African music scene. The result was the award-winning Graceland album and a new international focus on South African musicians like Johnny Clegg.
I decided to continue and formed a new band in 1986, in May 1986, and I called the band Savuka, which in Zulu means we have arisen. We would like to take our music and share it with the world. We're also very serious about sharing our hopes, our fears, our aspirations for our country, South Africa, which at the moment is undergoing tremendous change, struggle, and there are massive forces, emotional, intellectual, psychological, which are clashing in our country. And it's in this kind of birthplace that through the fire and the smoke and through the smiles, the humor, the anger, the fear, the terror, that we want to make our music and make our music felt.
I'm Carolyn Craven, one of the reporters for South Africa Now. Next week, we'll have more stories from the front lines in Southern Africa. We are also offering a free list of resources of information about the issues. Please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to South Africa Now, 361 West Broadway, New York, New York, 10013.
Ancient bones from old divide, echoes of the very first cry. Who may be here and why? Beneath the copper sun, African idea, African idea. Make the future clear, make the future clear. And we are scattered in South Africa.